welcome to the
I watched the Russian.
my opinion, Hello and welcome to an absolute barn burner of a Brussels Signal podcast. I'm almost losing for voice out of excitement. I don't think I have to introduce my guests. The gentleman Michael Avery and the gentle chicken Doomberg, they both have been on our show before, and I think it was absolute time to get both of them at the same time. The reason for this is, and usually I'm very sparse with compliments, but over the last couple of months, on many issues, the two of you have been more right than anybody else. Doomberg, I'm sure we're going to talk about your call on the Canadian elections, which was, you pretty much got it right before the betting markets even had Mike Carney on the list. And Michael, also your analysis of where the Trump administration is going was spot on even before Trump was even inaugurated. So both of you really were ahead of the curve by so many ways. One thing I would like to begin with, because I see some overlap in your approaches, even though you frame it slightly differently. So Michael, I was thinking maybe you could begin talking a little bit about something you have mentioned quite often recently, which is the question, what is GDP for? And then Doomberg, I would love you to chime in, because you wrote in a piece a couple of months ago that there are economies that are built for profit and there are economies that are built for purpose. And I think there is some overlap that would be interesting to explore.
Well, I don't think anyone needs to hear my own personal opinion of what GDP is for, because everyone should have one. And that's my key point. When I'm dealing with interlocutors who don't have an answer for what GDP should be for, particularly when they're in an area of authority, I worry. But I think if you look at the world around us, there is more and more recognition that you have to have more of a mission statement. And just to segue very, very briefly, for example, we've just seen the UK sign a free trade or agree a free trade deal with India this week, which, surprised some people because they didn't expect that was going to pop to the front of the list. And I was discussing that with a colleague and saying, well, look, if you look at the nitty gritty of the actual detail, it's politically quite difficult for the Prime Minister of the UK to wear in terms of some of the technicalities of it. And the economic benefit on the surface is extremely small. So there has to be some other vision behind that to take the political loss effectively of having to say that there are elements of this that many of the electorate won't like for a very, very small gain of around 9 British pence a week per person for the next couple of years. So is there a deeper mission to it behind that? Is there a deeper purpose, or is it just bad politics? Or is it just the old school thought of, we don't think what GDP is for, we're just doing this because it's a free trade deal? So those are the lenses that I look at and try and determine what people are going to do wearing them.
So this kind of brings us to Doomberg. What was your take on when you wrote that economy is built for purpose and economy is built for profit? Can you explain it to us a little bit?
Sure. So I think that the main fallacy that we object to with the modern measurement of gross domestic product is it treats basically all economic activity as equivalent in dollar value, when in reality there's a vast chasm between, say, the dollar value that you measure to be fully back integrated into hydrocarbons and the dollar value that you measure because you have a financial center in one of your large cities. And this manifests most commonly when Western geopolitical analysts use such GDP measurements of, say, the economy of Russia and compare it to various economies in Europe, and come to the erroneous conclusion that somehow these are geopolitically equivalent spheres of power, which by any objective measure, they most certainly are not. Even in the US, of course, many of the sort of the neocon crowd refer to Russia as a country with a gas station on it. I think this just vastly underestimates the power of one's geopolitical foes. And I think, as Russia has proven and China proves, geopolitical power is a derivative of your manufacturing power, and your manufacturing power is a derivative of your energy strategy. And so Europe, of course, gets this catastrophically wrong across all dimensions. At least the U.S. still has, full back integration to all of the sources of energy that it needs, which preserves the option to reindustrialize in the way that Trump is trying to accomplish. But I agree with Michael's framing wholeheartedly. You start with purpose, because the old adage in the corporate world, which is where I come from, is you get what you inspect, not what you expect. And if you have an erroneous measurement of GDP that you're trying to optimize for, you can end up in a situation where you have London and you don't make any steel anymore, which is why Britain is a sort of a vassal of its former self.
Can I chip in just very quickly there? Fantastic overview. Thank you, Doomberg. I tend to veer between the very granular and the very kind of helicopter view. So the granular one there, talking about this FTA between the UK and India, was just one example. But the more hypothetical helicopter view that I've used in several podcasts before is to say, what if everyone in a given country decided they wanted to be only a hairdresser? What if everyone tomorrow woke up and everyone in Switzerland said, let's be hairdressers? Would you have an economy? Sure. A very attractively hairdressed economy. Everyone would look good. But where does that put you in the geopolitical context, or even just a macroeconomic one? So clearly that's far from ideal. I think everyone would agree that. At which point, what do you think the economy should look like, and how should you be steering it? So it's kind of a ridiculous example compared to your much more practical realpolitik one, but it kind of underlines the seriousness of it with a joke, if you will.
Michael, you once said that in a recent interview where I think you did not hold back, that macroeconomics in the classical sense is no longer of interest to you, and what you focus on is grand macro strategy. I think you described it. Can you elaborate a little bit on what the term is? And you also, and I think Doomberg, you did the same thing. Both of you have been chroniclers, if you want, of a fundamental shift that is going on. So the comfortable 90s, if you want, the high point of globalization, what is very commonly called the liberal world order, whatever term you want to use, this appears to come to an end, or at least it's being transformed. Now, my question to both of you is, if you would have to pinpoint maybe either an event or the time window, if you want, when this started to change, what would it be? Why is it all of a sudden that we talk more about geopolitical competition, about the potential clash between China and the United States, Europe's decline? And when did this happen? Was this a long time in the making, and it's like an iceberg where we saw the top 10% and now we gradually see the remaining 90% under the surface? Or what has changed over the last couple of years?
I'll do the first part, and then maybe Doomberg, you do the second part of that. That's a long question. Grand macro strategy is something that I'm trying to use as a bit of a shtick at the moment, which is basically saying that if you understand how countries traditionally worked in the longer run of things, it was to look after their national interests, which was traditionally known in the political and economic sphere as grand strategy. How to be a great king or queen, for example. How do you make sure you survive in a zero-sum world out there, making sure your economy is for a purpose, which is national defense, and to expand your power where possible. So that was grand strategy, and we're all used to, up until recently, working in the field of macro strategy, CPI, payrolls, GDP, etc. It's not that has disappeared completely. We still have to look at it. I've spent years and years, decades looking at it. Right now, given the transitions that are underway on every kind of tectonic plate possible all at once, I'm not interested in what GDP was in the first quarter. I'm not even very interested in what GDP is going to be in the second quarter. I'm interested in what the shape of GDP and what GDP will be for in the second half of this year, 2026, 2027. And none of those answers are going to be found in the data yet, because they're all being decided at a grand macro strategy level. But over to you on when this all went wrong, Doomberg.
Yeah, so I concur with that. Actually, by coincidence, we're finishing up a piece we're going to publish later this week called Lyme's disease, Lyme's being spelled Limes, because we actually trace it all the way back to the discovery in 1745 that lime juice prevents scurvy, which of course was the precipitating catalyst for the British Royal Navy dominating the world. And that baton was handed to the U.S. after the Second World War. And there's this Lyme's disease that we call, is when you are at the top of the pile, you spend almost as much time trying to weaken your potential geopolitical rivals as you do just focusing on strengthening yourself. Britain, of course, lots of talk about the Baghdad to Berlin Railroad as a cause for World War I, and Lord knows that the world wars were catastrophic to the British Empire. And we're of the view that America is at the tail end of its own possession of the top spot. The unipolar world is coming to an end. I think Trump recognizes that, and it happened really in the 1980s. We wrote a piece called WrestleMania where we think, modeling Trump as wanting to get back to 1985, when Hulk Hogan was champion and Mike Tyson burst onto the scenes and everything about America was great, and Ronald Reagan and tax cuts and soaring economies and soaring stock markets. Well, the 1980s aren't walking through that door. In the intervening 40 years, we have outsourced the entirety of our manufacturing, well, not the entirety, but the core of our manufacturing base to China. And China, by many dimensions, although there's a lot of denial of this in the West, has surpassed the U.S. in many important ways. And the combination of Russia, Iran, China, and North Korea form a really formidable axis to basically remove the U.S. from the top spot. I think the future direction is towards multipolarity, which means different things to different countries and different leaders within those countries. But the U.S., through its own sort of financialization, Wall Street-driven quarterly profit pressures, the way management in the U.S. is compensated via options, the U.S. has effectively hollowed out its military. We half-jokingly refer to China as the new arsenal of democracy because they make so many weapons for the Western militaries. And so that's just unsustainable. We sort of view a civil war going on in the U.S. between traditional Pentagon/MAGA, and then on the other side you have sort of Wall Street and the intelligence community who are proponents of the policies that got us to the current situation. And at the moment, the Trump wing of that war has the upper hand. But that's fleeting, and there are two major risks to it, and then I'll turn it back over. I know this is a bit of a long answer, but I think it's an important one. The first risk is that Trump runs out of political capital before he can effect the transition, and then we pivot back. And then the second risk is the transition just doesn't work, and we end up in a hot war with China that we don't look likely to win, which, of course, unless you're willing to use nuclear weapons, we think that China probably has escalation dominance, especially on the Taiwan issue. So I know there was a lot there, Ralph, but that's sort of our view.
No, that's great, because it really brings us to, I think, the most obvious question. In your writings, both of you describe a world that is becoming more competitive. Now, my question is, do you think that the current US administration, and Trump in particular, are there policies aimed, like, within kind of acknowledging this new world order or this emerging new world order, and they're trying to address it? Or is this something that we try to project some method into the madness and there really is no real plan? So, because this is kind of what's out there in these debates. Some people say, oh no, this is the famous 4D chess game. Others say, oh no, this is just Trump. He likes tariffs and doesn't really understand how the economy works, and it's all Peter Navarro pulling the strings in the background. Or maybe it's a mixture of both. So what would you say? Is there a strategy, or at least a recognition of a changing system that potentially also will need some pain in order to address it? Or is it just madness and noise and fury out there and nobody understands what's going on?
Well, I think people are going to see what they want to see. I'm surrounded by people who have passionate opinions on either side of that. And I think the truth is somewhere in the middle. But the analogy that best describes that is in a military situation, you can sometimes be given an objective. For example, we need to take that hill over there. And you draw up a plan of how you're going to get there. And immediately you start doing it, you come under heavy enemy fire. It's not possible to enact the particular tactics that you expected to use. You have to completely improvise. You run to the left rather than to the right. You do something completely out of the box, which manages to catch the enemy on the hop, and you still take the hill. So at the end of it, do you turn around and say that was a successful maneuver? Or was it a complete farce and pure blind luck that got you there? And if you start dissecting military campaign after military campaign, it's a grey area how many of them are actually really perfectly planned and perfectly executed, and how many through luck and judgment get there. And I do think there is a strategy from the Trump team. Now, maybe I'm projecting onto it what I want to see, but certainly before they started doing it, I was already saying if they're going to use economic statecraft, it would look like X, Y, Z. Lo and behold, just keep ticking boxes of what they're doing. So that tells me that they are doing it, but you have to be tactically flexible. You have to be prepared to say, right, we retreat here, we move left there, we move right there, but we still keep moving towards the same overall target. That would be my view on that.
So you adapt the tactics, but the strategy itself, the final goal, remains in place.
I think so.
I mean, Doomberg, you have, as I mentioned in the introduction, more than anybody else predicted what's going to happen with the elections in Canada. So maybe you can just very quickly tell us how you came to those conclusions, what your model, if you will, was, because that tells me if you can predict something, that tells me that then there must be a pattern. There must be, it cannot be all just like the rolling of a dice. There must be something more behind it. And I think you made a very strong case that that is indeed what's going on when we look at what happened in Canada and their relationship with the United States.
Yeah, I should begin by maybe following up with what Michael just said, because it actually dovetails into how we came to the conclusion as to what would transpire in Canada. There is certainly a plan. In between when Trump was elected and before he was inaugurated, we watched every minute of the Agenda 47 videos that he had posted starting in March of 2023 or February of 2023. And he lays out a very, very clear, succinct, to the point plan across all dimensions of his second administration. And he has followed through to the letter on those stated ambitions. And it was very clear, listening to Trump, because, by the way, it's very difficult for Trump to not tell you what he's actually thinking. I mean, if you listen to him as opposed to read his Truth Social tweets, which I think are a little bit more tactical and consist of a fair bit of trolling, he will tell you what's really on his mind. And we got an indication early on that, A, Trump was going to focus on the Western Hemisphere, wanted out of Europe, viewed the resources of the Arctic and Greenland and the Panama Canal and Canada as part of the U.S.'s sphere of influence. And he clearly saw that Trudeau was in deep, deep trouble. And I think he played a knowing role in orchestrating Carney's ascension, both initially replacing Trudeau and then winning the election, for a variety of reasons, but one of them we think is that there's a Western Hemispheric objective of unsticking Alberta's energy. And of course, our interest in Canadian politics flows directly to Alberta's energy because it is one of the largest hydrocarbon resource bases in the world. And it's landlocked, and the Canadian constitutional system is a mess. It's not even finalized. Borders and territorial names are changing all the time. The relationship between the provinces in Ottawa and within and between the provinces themselves is hardly even a free market. So there's a lot of instability in Canada, and I think if you change American energy dominance to North American energy dominance, then the actions with regard to Canada and even to a certain extent Mexico and Venezuela begin to make a lot more sense. And so we got a hunch, and we pride ourselves on our ability to think laterally. And one of our favorite expressions in the office is that the model need not be right, it just needs to work. And we had a hunch that Trump wanted Carney in the job. Now, Trump and Carney and Brookfield Asset Management have a long and complex history, and you could easily get into some tinfoil as to why it would be that Carney would be the chosen one. But before Carney was a contract you could bet on Polymarket, we wrote a piece in very early December called Alberta Clipper, where we began to develop this model that Carney would win. And by the way, the Conservatives, Pierre Poilievre was at 93% probability of winning the election on Polymarket when we wrote that piece. And we said Carney's going to replace Trudeau, and with the full support of the notoriously pliant Canadian media, you should not be underestimating his chances. The powers that be that control Canada get what they want, and they don't really care to cover their tracks. They make it pretty easy to see what's happening. And so we made that call, part of a larger call, where we think what happens next is a fake constitutional crisis is provoked, because that gives Mark Carney the political air cover to walk back the green energy net zero nonsense that he has been a proponent of. And a grand bargain will be struck. Alberta will get its infrastructure to unstick its energy. Quebec will finalize its role in the Canadian Constitution, and Orange Man Bad will have unified Canada in a way that few other politicians could have done. So what we're seeing now is the next phase of that series of predictions. If we could be wrong, and once the model stops working, we'll abandon it. But we think Carney and Trump will cut a favorable deal on tariffs here, which will give Carney some political capital in Canada. And then the Alberta separatist crisis will emerge, and there will be a grand negotiation between Alberta and Quebec and Ottawa, and everything will be settled, driven by the fear stray from unity because of Orange Man bad.
So could one say that Trump's strategy or the current administration strategy is not the United States of America, but the United States of the Americas?
Yeah, well, I think this 51st state talk and Governor Trudeau talk was a key input into our model because it really did stick a finger in the wound of Canadian constitutional crisis, which is barely papered over, and very few analysts outside of Canada understand just how fragile the Canadian federal system is. And that whole we want to take Canada, this again, it's going to trigger that the national unity that you saw, if so ever briefly, which was the pivot point that allowed Justin Trudeau to exit stage left and for Carney to be installed. And then miraculously, this rather uncharacteristic banker is suddenly the hero Canada needs to face down Trump. And so Danielle Smith in Alberta is doing her part. She's already talking about holding referendums on the issue of separation from Canada. But you will notice that the 51st state talk has gone away, and President Trump refers to Mark Carney as Prime Minister of Canada, which is a country. And I think this was all very tactical, and so we called that early. And look, anytime you publish a long shot prediction under your own masthead, you take some business risk, but this time it worked.
Can I add one thing on that very briefly? I mean, that's a fascinating exposition, and I think I agree with just about all of it. I'm just finishing a piece at the moment in the background, trying to put Trumpism in the broadest sense into a historical context alongside other neo-mercantilists, because he's clearly a neo-mercantilist, which is a term that gets bandied around a lot, but without really being unpacked. But one historical parallel, which should be immediately clear, and I think it applies in Canada, and it also applied in Australia with their election recently, is that you don't tend to get neo-mercantilists of the world uniting. Nationalists of the world don't unite. One can be absorbed into a greater entity, but one doesn't necessarily sit there as an equal. So it would actually, I think, have been politically more difficult for Trump in some respects, as no expert on Canada at all, to be dealing with someone either in Canada or Australia who was a Trumpian figure looking for, genuinely Canada first, genuinely Australia first, because obviously that runs counter to the US first, with other countries then folded into a bloc under its tutelage, which of course requires some sacrifices. There are gains to be made there, that there are sacrifices compared to the existing model. And I think last time we spoke, Ralph, I mentioned this, and let me just underline it again. I'm quite confident that one of the things that Trump is going to be arguing is that Canada, under this new deal, has to freeze out China in the same way that the US has. We can't have transshipment of Chinese goods. Preferably you have the same tariff that the US sets. So if you have something akin to that, it's not just the union of the North America, it's effectively a European Union style North America, where trade policy is set not by Brussels, but by Washington, D.C. And everyone else gets to retain sovereignty, but it's very limited sovereignty, because you can't do X, you can't do Y, you can't do Z. And if you can't choose who you're trading with, effectively you have no one to trade with but the US. And no one would ever sign up for that voluntarily. You couldn't get a Canadian equivalent of a Trump winning an election and saying, yes, I'll have some of that, please. So therefore he didn't mind who won in that respect.
In your the question goes to both of you. In your estimate, if hypothetically the Trump administration or any other administration would succeed in creating a somewhat integrated economic sphere from the southern tip of Latin America up to Alaska, based on simply the hydrocarbon resource, the energy resources, could that be an almost independent economic sphere that could maintain current levels of wealth? Would that be possible, or is that too much of a dream of autarky?
I mean, I could take. The Western Hemisphere already is in that position. The Western Hemisphere already, with a hand and a half tied behind its back, outproduces the entire Middle East in oil, and by a wider margin, natural gas. The U.S. is in possession of perhaps the world's best coal reserves. 93 operating nuclear reactors in the U.S. All the the prairies of Canada and the farm belt of the U.S., the Mississippi River system, the ample supply of labor across the Western Hemisphere. There is really no need for the U.S. to be policing the Middle East. That's really China's source of energy today. That's a theme of our upcoming piece, Lyme's disease, why the U.S. feels the need to prevent countries in other parts of the world from connecting to each other in ways that are mutually beneficial for them when we have our own issues to deal with on the home front, is beyond us. But yeah, I think, food, fertilizer, chemicals, gas, oil, coal, nuclear, all the uranium deposits in Canada, forestry products, automotive manufacturing base. We have everything that is needed in this side of the world to make a go of it. And then who's ever going to invade it? Good luck, especially the U.S. with every household having multiple guns. And so the Department of Defense ought to be the Department of Defense, not the Department of Proactive Offense. And I think last point I'll make is much of the erroneous foreign policy of the forever wars can be traced back to this wrong-headed belief that the U.S. in particular was running out of oil and that peak oil was near. And that belief, we think, is the root cause of much of the foreign adventures where you go abroad in search of energy supplies. If you don't have them on the home front, then at least make sure that the proxies you control have access to them. And as a derivative of that, your adversaries shouldn't have access to it. And so this is why we see, the control of the seas and the shipping lanes being so important still in 2022 or 2025. Sorry. Even though this is a centuries-old strategic axiom. And so hopefully we can, get away from such thinking.
Well, I think we are overlooking industrial production on that front. Clearly that's what all the tariffs are about, and that's what a lot of the underlying dynamic is about. Can we get industry to start moving back to the Western Hemisphere? And for a couple of years, I've been arguing now that one of the strategies that Trump would likely employ, purely hypothetically, but the pieces are there now on the table, is to say, look, we know that in China, for example, there's a cluster producing products X, Y, and Z with a provincial GDP per capita of roughly what it is in Brazil. We would rather that was made in Brazil. So, okay, we're going to give you Fed swap lines, we're going to give you dollar credit to help build all the infrastructure that you need, because, frankly, the pieces aren't there right now. But if we put the right tariff framework in place, if you're tariffed at 10% and they're tariffed at 145, we can start to enact that change. But it's got to be very strategic. You have to be looking at what is made in the Chinese economy, which is a patchwork of different GDP per capita and production nexuses, and saying where would you like them transplanted to. So it needs to be semi-planned. The market won't take care of all of it. But yeah, that could be done, and I think that may be part of what is looking at being done. But there's a while to go before we get there, even if we get the agreement in the next couple of months about what the actual strategy is.
There are two arguments that each of you made that I'd like to combine. Michael, you recently said in an interview, and that really stuck with me, that in a world of ever more sophisticated AI and robotics, the labor argument that you have to move production to a place where labor is cheap, that might be something of the past. That could change. And Doomberg, in your most recent piece on the chips war with China, you made the argument that sanctions are not the way. What you have to try to do is to stay ahead in research and development, so you don't try to prevent others from getting good chips. You just have to make sure that you always have the better chips. And I think this is both of your arguments combine quite nicely into a very interesting picture of what a future economy could look like, where you have robotics, where you have artificial intelligence, and then you can produce many of the things that are currently produced outside of the United States or outside of, let's say, the Western Hemisphere, within the Western Hemisphere. However, there's one wrinkle to that argument I would like to explore with you, which is that of course would mean that if production comes back, if manufacturing comes back, it would then most likely come back, quote unquote, to the robots, but not the working class that Trump likes to talk about. So there is a chance that he might succeed in his plans of strengthening the Western Hemisphere, of bringing back manufacturing, but still maybe not having as positive an effect on the working class, so what remains of the working class, that he would like to see, or that his supporters would like to see.
Yeah, well, I think AI and robotics and automation certainly open those doors, not for every industry all at once, but over time going forward, more and more of them. So that does make the transportation that we were talking about from Asia back to the Western Hemisphere, whether it's directly in the US or because, not everyone can do everything, to neighboring countries, which, by the way, sometimes you might need to offer as a carrot. If you're only going to be thinking purely about yourself, you're not going to get people to come on that journey with you if they themselves are having to make trade-offs between growing or doing X and not growing and doing Y, which is what you're actually asking them, to be doing. It opens doors, and more of them will open over time. Generally within society, I don't think anyone has a clear idea of just how disruptive it's going to be. Certainly 12 months ago, I thought most of the AI that I had commercially available to me was an absolute joke. I couldn't see any use for it whatsoever. Increasingly, I am actually starting to use it at the margin. I can see, yep, that's actually saving me time doing X, Y, Z. Now, I wouldn't want to be a new employee in this business coming through who hasn't learned how to do things for themselves, because it still makes egregious errors that you have to have a lot of experience to spot for the moment. But eventually those will be ironed out. And then we don't know as a society what we have to do. That will be a whole new challenge, not just for Trumpism, but for China, for Europe, for Latin America, for everybody. For those of you who are familiar with the literature, are we going to go to a Judge Dredd scenario where you have mass unemployment and everyone is just bored out of their minds committing crime and you're just trying to keep law and order? Or do we move to some kind of, past imagined paradise where everyone just has so much free time because of the productivity that we can sit around, playing kumbaya, humming kumbaya around the campfire and toasting marshmallows? And I'm a cynic, so I say it's more likely to be the bad than the good outcome. But that's a bridge we're all going to be crossing together.
Yeah, I would say in our personal investing lives, we have become intimately familiar with the cutting edge of AI development, and we are deeply bullish on the fact that it will be a profoundly impactful technological development, almost certainly more consequential than the development of the internet itself. And it will take time. There's lots of fraud, there's bubbles, there's all manner of things that you see during such tectonic shifts, but the direction of travel is clear. The impacts are difficult to forecast, as Michael has correctly said, but there is one thing that is easy to forecast, which is AI is a derivative of energy. And the countries that have the most energy have the most potential to host the most data centers and train the most sophisticated models and keep the inferences computing away. And right now, the U.S. has a huge lead in that regard, especially because of its access to what we believe is effectively a limitless supply of dirt cheap natural gas. And China is arming itself with thermal coal, and it is burning more than half of the coal that is burned on Earth. It produces more than enough coal for its own domestic needs, and yet is still importing, which tells us it's stockpiling. And it is the main, and some would argue perhaps even slightly ahead of the U.S. in the AI arms race. I think DeepSeek shocked a lot of people, didn't shock us. But in the end, if you don't have a reasonable energy strategy, you will not be a significant player in the AI space just because of the energy required to build and run and develop AI algorithms.
Would you say that on the broadest possible picture, what we were just discussing, that this is probably the core question of the future, right? Energy, AI, robotics, the future of work, as Michael described, whether it's going to be roasting marshmallows all day or the Judge Dredd scenario, we will see. But that this is going to be the big question of the future, and that some things that occupy so much space, justifiably so, because there's so much human suffering connected to it. But the things like the war in Ukraine, for example, is almost like an echo of an era past, wars for territory, wars for population, things that, expansion of countries in a geographical sense, that this is something that made sense probably from certain aspects 100 years ago, maybe even, 80 years ago. But this is an almost reactionary approach to politics. It's going to consume, understandably, a lot of energy, a lot of time, a lot of economic resources. But the true battles are fought somewhere else. They're fought in the realm of advanced microchips, in the realm of robotics, in the realm of efficient use of energy and these things.
Yeah, I would say, look, for sure, we think the development of AI and robotics diminishes the importance of demographics in the modeling of the future prosperity of nations. So I think that is a pretty safe bet. At least the early products that are flowing out of the labs, as Michael alluded to, they make experts better. They are really fantastic lead generators, which then need to be, fact-checked by a human for their own purposes. But if you play around with them enough, you get pretty good at recognizing when your BS detector needs to intervene. And then, the last thing we would say is the value. This is sort of a lateral thinking prediction that we haven't really shaped out yet, but I've been meaning to write a piece on it for some time. AI algorithms don't buy things. Humans still buy things. the economy is still driven by humans, and we have a belief, perhaps an optimistic take on things, that in the economy that follows, the value of that which is distinctly and uniquely human is set to skyrocket. Because humans will still be humans. We're not big believers in the, Kurzweilian vision of the transcending of biology by humanity into some machine-human hybrid. Perhaps it'll happen, but I think a more likely outcome is, humans still spend the money, and the things that humans will want to spend the money on will have a distinctly human flair to it, and that's an entire part of the economy that I think is booming already, and is perhaps under the radar for most macroeconomic analysts.
Ralph, can I just chip in something there for a moment?
Yes.
You might find interesting at a margin of this, which is obviously robotics and technology have physical inputs beside energy. So you were just implying that, or perhaps I was picking up that you were implying that maybe in the future we can move away from the more confrontational geopolitics that we have now.
Yes.
Worryingly, I think the opposite is going to be true. As I said, you've got a physical input for everything that we need to assemble now, and obviously energy is at the top of that list, but there are others. Every key component, every rare earth, every mineral, et cetera, which are obviously of fixed supply and very often in very difficult geographies with very difficult people running the countries, which require physical power to get out rather than contracts and handshakes, etc. But above and beyond that, there was an interesting working paper written by the PBOC a couple of years ago, which I published a paper on when it came out, in which they were looking at their own future demographics, and they could see then that the population was going to be collapsing. And what they very clearly said is we will automate to get around that, which is, of course, what they are doing. But they also made clear that when you start aging as a society, of course, you run down accumulated savings. That's just a natural macro side effect of what starts to happen. So the corollary of that is you should logically start moving towards running a trade deficit and a current account deficit, because you're no longer building up your national savings, you're running them down. So to do that obviously starts moving you down the power pyramid within the current sphere that we're in now. We're talking about China, for example, saying, no, okay, we're going to be like the US and running a trade deficit. We'll be relying on other countries to supply us with goods as we run down these savings, rather than producing more and more and building our savings up. And what this PBOC working paper clearly said, and it was only written by a few economists, it didn't have the seal of approval of, coming from the party central committee, but you don't write something like that for no reason. They said, we'll never allow that to happen. Never. This is a sign of societal and national and economic weakness were that to ever happen. And however small our population gets, we will continue to push the frontiers of automation to make sure that we can continue producing even more with a smaller population and an older one, so we can continue increasing our savings forever, or keeping them at a very high rate forever. So maybe this is a specific Chinese issue, which is obviously what's playing out in the trade war, maybe. But I do think if we get country after country after country all going off of a demographic cliff at the same time, well, everyone can't run down their savings at the same time. You're going to have some running in deficits and some running to run surpluses, and power dynamics will shift within that. And I can see that being a driver for a very unhappy phase of geopolitics for a long time going forward, on just as fundamental a level as the energy dynamic, which Doomberg is talking about.
But isn't this the great irony of our age, that so often, and all of us have learned in our IR classes and similar situations, that the greatest risk, or one of the greatest risks to war breaking out, is if there's a rising power, if there's a competition for the top. But it seems to me that we at least in certain cases, almost have a competition between declining powers, and everybody's panicking that what if I decline faster than the other guy, so now I have to move now because in a year or two I no longer have the opportunity to do so. I mean, this happened before between Germany and Russia, but overall it was between the one on the top and the other one trying to climb up to the top. But now it seems almost more it's who is falling down faster, if you will.
Yeah, well, demographically, that's very true. I mean, if you look specifically at the sociology, the historical sociology of how countries cope with the fact that they suddenly realize their populations will start shrinking. I presume you're fairly well acquainted with it, but there are lots of historical examples of societies really going off of the cliff. Once people realize, wow, there are going to be vastly fewer countrymen going forward, and then vastly fewer again another generation hence, it does become a bit of a desperate gamble. Forget about the automation we're talking about and the focus on GDP, just in terms of what's my place in the world. It's destabilizing if you fear that other countries around you are not experiencing the same thing.
Yeah, so I would only add, we watched Japan with keen interest because they have resisted the temptation to make up the shortfall with immigration, which is the experiment that Europe was largely running with arguably quite mixed results. But I think it matters that if all of your neighbors are going through similar declines at the same time, you might have less competitive pressure. So Korea obviously is a demographic basket case. China is going into decline. Japan is already well along the path. And you note that the three of them are sort of coming ever so slightly closer together as a result of the tariffs war and baby steps towards reducing tensions. The one region of the world that is far above replacement rate with its fertility is Africa. Africa was the subject of our latest Doom Zoom presentation for April for Pro-Tier members. And Africa is booming demographically. It has many, many challenges. The opportunities there are enormous, of course. But the interesting thing about the fact that the one place in the world that is above replacement rate isn't considered a nuclear power of any sort of relevance, and so it doesn't really threaten people. So it's a very interesting dynamic. I don't think, obviously, a very complex situation, difficult to model, but when we look for sort of outliers like that and try to ponder what they mean, if everybody around you is declining, it's less of an issue. And if the power that is demographically the most favored in the world in sub-Saharan Africa, I think, is at a replacement rate of 4.5. If they're not a nuclear power and they don't threaten anybody, and economically, of course, they have a long ways to go before they would get there as well. So it could be that, again, when you combine that analysis with the rise of AI and robotics, which blunts the impact of demographics, I think perhaps it might not be as dire.
I think it's a good moment where we can tie together two issues. Now, we started out with a conversation about GDP. And over the last couple of weeks, there were many headlines that now that Germany has a new government and they have unleashed the debt brake and there will be more spending, up to €1 trillion, 500 billion for the military, 500 billion for infrastructure. So this is the Zeitenwende, the turning point for Germany. Germany will lead again, and all of this, some people would say nothing worse than if Germany leads, but I leave that aside. And now I'm sure that you all have followed the news over the last 24 hours. The new German chancellor, the first one in the Federal Republic since 1945, needed 2 rounds of voting to be confirmed as German chancellor, which means that he doesn't even have full command over his own coalition that was supposed to vote him into office in the first round. And sometimes I wonder, even within the news media that we all consume, Bloomberg and the Financial Times, it doesn't matter if a country like Germany tries to unleash 500 billion into the military, if the energy and industrial base is no longer there to actually do something with this money, as one aspect. And another one, Michael, that you mentioned, that we have to look at the bigger picture, including also societal factors, which is that nobody in Germany would be willing, or only a very small number, would be willing to defend Europe or Germany or the Baltic states, or you name it, weapon in hand. So it doesn't matter if you give them the newest, finest rifle that just ran fresh off the conveyor belt. If people don't want to fight for whatever reason, that's not going to make a difference. And sometimes I feel this human factor, Doomberg, that you also alluded to, is completely overlooked. You can have the greatest equipment, but if there is no will to fight for whatever it might be, then that equipment, that GDP, if you want, becomes almost meaningless.
Yeah, well, I mean, clearly the pressing question short term is, what is GDP for? Just to repeat that. But without being, too reductive, I think you can also ask, Germany doesn't know what Germany is for. And you can apply the same thing to a greater or lesser degree, largely lesser, across many Western democracies at the moment. What are they for? What's the, you can hear I'm British. What's Great Britain for? If you ask Keir Starmer that, the Prime Minister, what would he tell you? I think he'd have to really seriously think about it for a while. And again, it's staggering to a degree that could be true of our elected leadership class. But it largely is because they're still the product of a pipeline of effectively, what the French call fonctionnaires, just bureaucrats who just had to micromanage, a neoliberal system where basically all the big decisions were made at a higher level of power architecture, if you will. You could tweak a little bit here or there, but basically all the decisions were taken for you, as they are within Europe too. So until we actually start seeing a real sense of responsibility and the recognition of the power that is in people's hands again, you might not even start getting politicians of the breed that recognize that's what needs to be done. And only when you get those people actually close to power or in power do you then start getting the question being asked properly of what is GDP for. But I think the countries that get there first, and obviously America is there at the moment, even if not the entire society is going with them, are the ones who are going to be setting the pace, and the ones that, to pivot back to what I was saying at the beginning, are still signing free trade deals because that's what we're supposed to do. And then you go and tell your voters, well, it's going to give you 9 pence a week, alongside a lot of caveats that we're not quite sure how they'll work out, including, for example, a huge shortfall in tax revenue, because part of the deal, by the way, without getting too boring for people who don't follow the intricacies, is that India and the UK have agreed that Indian workers working in the UK temporarily and British workers working in India temporarily don't have to contribute to each other's national insurance pension schemes. Now, how many Brits work in India? Not very many. How many Indians are likely to come and work in the UK? Quite a few. So the revenue shortfall you could get over a 3-year period, back of an envelope, can easily exceed any economic gain that you're penciling in from a country which is going to continue exporting to the UK because the UK has very low tariffs anyway, and is so poor it's not going to buy much from the UK because the UK also don't manufacture very much. So there's almost no gains to be made from trade, more from the movement of people, and with a revenue shortfall from that on the UK side. So is that being signed just because you have a government that doesn't know what to do or what GDP is for or what the UK is for? Or, and I did allude to this earlier, is there a much bigger picture, clever, 4-dimensional chess game being played, as Doomberg was alluding to in Canada, where this is an attempt by the UK to get close to India, at least to establish that relationship in the hope that then maybe something can be agreed with Trump, who's, of course, locking onto Canada, and then we start looking at some kind of Western bloc within which, the rules against China can then be drawn up, largely by DC, and then we have a completely different what's the West for plus friends like India. So, I don't know when we're going to get there. I don't know if we're going to get there, but these are the vital questions, and we're either close to it or very far away, depending on how you look at recent developments.
I mean, Michael, you once made an argument that also stuck with me and that I use myself very often now, is you once mentioned that China is not pursuing an economic policy for market share, but they want to control supply chains. And Doomberg, you on the other hand, have written precisely about this in the area of renewable energy, right? That they dominate solar panel production, for example. You've written about electric vehicles, the Chinese approach, all these areas. So I think this is where your analysis complements each other quite nicely. Now, whatever one thinks about the Chinese, it seems to me, and maybe this is just an outsider view, that there is some purpose, some strategy. There is almost a crystal clear sense of what they try to attempt. In the case of the United States, and we of course have to touch on Europe a little bit, and I mean this as a great admirer and friend of the United States, but sometimes it strikes me that it's a country very lucky geographically, natural resource-wise, a very innovative economy, like great minds. They flock to the United States for various reasons. But even in our conversation now, one has to shift to all things happening to find a strategy. And I'm not saying there isn't one, but it almost seems a contradiction in itself to say there is a grand US strategy, which I think the United States had in the past, but it doesn't seem like it currently. And this worries me a little bit because there are some people out there very sanguine and saying in a conflict between the US and China, the US will definitely prevail. And the argument, Doomberg, that you have made on many occasions, which I wholeheartedly agree with, when was the last time that the United States really did not just win the war on the battlefield, but where they also won then the peace afterwards? Sure, they defeated Saddam's army, they defeated the Taliban, but afterwards it was like the dog that catches the car. They didn't know what to do. And now in many of these places, Afghanistan is the best example, the same people are in charge whom you once defeated in battle. This is like, the Nazis taking over Germany again in 1955. I'm not saying that everybody else is more brilliant than the United States or has a better strategy, but if somebody has any kind of cohesive strategy and somebody has a somewhat cohesive strategy, the latter probably has an advantage over the former.
Yeah, so a couple of points just to tie up a bunch of loose ends. the UK signing a trade deal with India makes a lot of sense when you consider that Apple is moving all of its production there, and that perhaps India will play the role of China with the Western bloc in the world order that emerges from what's transpiring today. On Europe, real quick, I think there's this globalism has peaked, and the European leaders have not yet internalized that, and so both the European Commission and leaders like Stammer and Macron don't yet realize that they're wildly unpopular, that nationalism is on the rise, and Germany, of course, is going through that. And I think Merz's flip between the campaign and after he was elected, and the whole manner in which the constitutional debt brake was relieved, was extremely controversial, underhanded, and has deeply eroded his popularity, especially in Eastern Germany. And one wonders whether the country of Germany itself might not split apart as a consequence of all of this. So then, to your question about, the grand strategy, there's a real challenge in the U.S. It is a very polarized country, and geopolitics takes more than 4 years to sustainably turn around. And so if you just take renewables, which we've written very critically about, it is still wildly unfair for wind energy developers and solar energy developers to go from the Biden administration, the spigots are open, to boom, 1.5% difference in the popular vote, and your business has been destroyed. The capital cycle of the energy markets and the political cycle of geopolitics is just longer than 4 years. And this whiplash is deeply destabilizing because, look, if Trump loses or whoever runs in Trump's place, if J.D. Vance runs and loses and the Democrats return to power, Gavin Newsom is now the president, you're going to see another 180-degree bit flip in the opposite direction. And I think that actually, in ways that few have characterized, makes it very difficult for the U.S. to credibly assemble the type of bloc that it will need to create, that power nexus that thrives in a world where Russia, Iran, and China are on the other side of it. And do the European leaders want to be part of the American bloc? Well, perhaps not so much with Trump in charge, but Trump's in charge now. And so, it's a very interesting time for all of the reasons we've talked about, of course, and trying to make sense of it. It can be challenging. But I do think that 4-year cycle of U.S. politics is an input into analysis that needs to be considered.
Can I just, as a very quick provocative intersection, wouldn't that almost justify the existence of a deep state, meaning that you need somebody who brings continuity despite these 4-year political cycles?
Not if the purpose of the deep state is to continue on the path of deindustrialization that it has been on for 40 years.
Yeah.
And that is the source of the civil war in the U.S. Michael, go ahead. I know
I was going to say,
sorry.
I agree on everything that was just being said. First of all, try the 3-year cycle in Australia. It's even worse. But I think what's important here, again, is to take just a step back for a second. We've been talking about some tactics, which is how you do something. We've been talking about strategy or grand strategy or grand macro strategy, which is, from a bigger perspective, what you're trying to achieve. But I also think it's very important to take one more step back and think about ideology, which is why you're trying to do it. So the deep state obviously have an ideology, which has been this deindustrialization, because they still thought that would create some kind of perfect world whereby we would all be so integrated together that you couldn't have the conflicts which are now arising. I think it was a desperately naive ideology. But I think what you are seeing both in the US, very, very overtly, in Europe to a lesser degree, but it's starting to build now. It's not something you're going to see in the Financial Times. It's not something you're going to see in the Wall Street Journal. You have to see this on social media, and in some of the darker corners sometimes, is attempts to actually genuinely start changing people's mindset. Not politicians doing it directly, but smaller groups. And sometimes that percolates up, and you actually see politicians reacting to it rather than politicians pushing it down, which can also happen too. It's a bilateral mechanism or a two-way mechanism. Once you've got that ideology, then it's easier to get a long-term buy-in to a grand strategy, and then the tactics take care of themselves effectively. So I'm watching very, very carefully and very, very closely once you start seeing signs of that emerging. And you are seeing, for example, I mean, the US is a very extreme example, but there are others in Asia too. In society after society, radical shifts in Gen Z coming through now in terms of how they are seeing the world compared to others. Differences between how men and women, young men and women, are seeing things, and stark differences from obviously how the boomers see things. So I think we will start definitely getting some traction in ways that people will be surprised by over the next few years.
It unfortunately leads me to the question, which is that if the world continues on the trajectory on which it currently is, will that mean, and you don't have to answer this, but I would be very curious, that at least on the short to medium run, most of us will probably get poorer, or the average person will probably get poorer and not richer?
Who's the average person? You see, this is part of the what does GDP mean question. Yeah. I can see plenty of scenarios where people will be much better off in some geographies, in some social demographics. And I can see very realistic scenarios where a swathe of people in other countries, in other demographics, will be far worse off. And of course, there are worst case scenarios where everyone's worse off, almost everywhere. I think those are actually the least likely. But certainly, you cannot have a global paradigm, which we have had for about 45 years, where certain countries have done far better than others, and a certain demographic in almost every country has done exceptionally better than everybody else, and have broad recognition right the way around the world that this is true, and then start seeing all the policies being put in place to try and undermine that, which we are seeing too, but then turn around and say, oh, but that won't reverse. Well, of course it will. That's the whole bloody point. You can't do it without those that were first now being last, in a biblical sense. Whether it's done the easy way or the hard way, that's the path we're on at the moment.
The reason why I'm asking is because, and I'm sure you gentlemen followed this, there was this interview, I think it was on NBC with Kristen Welker by Donald Trump, where he said, well, a beautiful young girl doesn't need 30 dolls, 3 are enough, and they don't need 250 pencils, 5 are, or they can have, I think he said they can have 5. And this reminded me of something at great mockery. Bernie Sanders was saying, I think in 2013 or 2016, when he said there don't have to be, I think it was 26 different kinds of deodorant and 26 pairs of sneakers or something. So apparently the future of Donald Sanders or Bernie Trump is a world with fewer dolls, fewer pencils, sneakers and deodorants.
Well, yeah, but let me just very quickly, sorry, I don't mean to jump in again. I was literally writing today on that front that on one level, yes, this sounds like degrowth. This sounds like a very leftist platform or an environmentalist platform, or something that you would never associate, with a consumer figure like Donald Trump. But again, if you look at the history of the ideology of neo-mercantilism right the way around the world, which is far more important and widespread than people give it credit for, because it's just not taught in most universities, that actual sentiment, you don't need $30, you need 3 or 4. You don't need 250 pencils, you need 5. Only applies provided they're imported. That was his point. If they're imported, you can get by with 5. Once they're made in America, go and buy 300. And that's the pivot. So I don't think he's suddenly anti-consumer. I think he's anti-import.
Doomberg?
Yeah, I agree. Look, I think Marvin Barth has probably the best framing of the Trump administration that I've read at the Thematic Markets. I can't recommend his work more strongly. He models Trump through the lens of Andrew Jackson, which is sort of reaching pretty far back in U.S. history. Trump's objective is to re-equalize the distribution of wealth towards his base. I watched with amazement as our friends and former colleagues in the energy sector, 95% of whom voted for Trump, couldn't internalize that American energy dominance means a lot more oil, and a lot more oil means a lot cheaper oil, and cheaper oil means lower stock prices. This is the same thing happening across multiple dimensions, and Trump doesn't really care about the stock market. The Fed put is no longer in equities, it's in the long bond, or in the 10-year, I should say. And so, like, Andrew Jackson was a populist. He wanted to destroy the power of Washington, D.C. and return it to the states. Tell me if any of this sounds familiar. He had huge battles with the judiciary who tried their best to impede his progress. Many people claimed he was acting in unconstitutional ways. He was an extravagant personality who got into duels, and like literal duels. And so there's a real close analogy. And I think if you want to understand where this is going directionally, I think Marvin's work, again, his work, I don't take credit for it. I just find it interesting. And it's pretty insightful.
I mean, this is almost, I mean, this is so fascinating. Could one say, another somewhat provocative statement, that the fact that Donald Trump lost the election in 2020 and had then 4 years, you alluded to this as well, Doomberg, and you as well, Michael, right? When we look at the Agenda 47, a lot of what happened was said before, to put together a plan, to say, when we get reelected, we gonna hit the ground running, and then we're gonna implement as quickly as we can, as much as we can, regardless of what the courts will do. We'll deal with that later. What the media say, we'll deal with that later. So that one might almost get the impression we are not in the second Trump term, if you want, or in Trump year 5. We're actually in Trump year 9, because those 4 years were used to put together a strategy that is now being implemented. So that the loss in 2020 was almost causal for everything that's going on now, or for a lot of things that are going on
Yeah,
now.
I completely agree. I've had similar conversations with friends saying that, first of all, it was causal, and secondly, it gave obviously voters the chance to see the alternative scenario and say, okay, we're more amenable to that now, which we probably wouldn't have been if we hadn't wanted to reject something else first. But again, just one more little cherry on the cake that I was trying to present to you earlier. We have plenty of people saying, historically Trump is like X. I think the Andrew Jackson example is an excellent one. And of course, he himself keeps talking about the fact that he likes President McKinley because of his tariffs. Now, if you read the financial press, people refer to that, and they'll briefly refer to McKinley, and they'll briefly refer to the fact there were tariffs. They might even notice he was assassinated. But nobody, because we just simply don't spend enough time intellectually looking at it, will look at, okay, what was McKinley's ideology? And he was a student of Friedrich List. And I don't know if anyone listening knows Friedrich List, but of course, he was more of a neo-mercantilist than Alexander Hamilton. And, you can read what List wrote. It's still freely available out there. And it, again, matches a great deal of what Trump is doing. But people don't want to go into the long grass to actually presume there might be a coherent ideology behind this. Because if you do that, rather than just saying Orange Man bad, it's madness, it's chaos, you are establishing there's an ideology. People might read that ideology and they might actually like that ideology. Friedrich List was incredibly influential at the time. He converted Otto von Bismarck from being a free trader to being a protectionist after 1870. He influenced the course of the world in various different countries by shifting them towards protectionism and neo-mercantilism. Same in Japan, building on older cultural traditions. So for goodness sakes, don't let anyone think there's a coherent body of thought here. Don't let anyone be reading it, because they might start getting ideas. Now, I'm being slightly facetious, but I genuinely think there's an element of deliberate denial and obfuscation from the financial press and the bien-pensant thinkers around the world, because they don't want people to think this could potentially be coherent.
Oh my God, shouldn't we all be worried if German economists are coming back in vogue, or coming back in fashion? That seems like a horrible, horrible scenario for the future.
Well, read List and see.
So, I mean, I don't want to gaslight our viewers or neither you. I've been from the outset very sympathetic to the Trump administration. So my question to you, Doomberg, would be, if we look, and many of the things that you have predicted, at what Trump is doing, is he, and also connecting it to what Michael said, is this the execution of, let's say, an ideology that emerged in isolation within Trump's mind, his team within the United States? Or are they trying, and we'll see if it works out, to react to a changing world that would have changed anyways? So my question, I guess, is, could they just have continued in either the Barack Obama or Bill Clinton or Joe Biden or George W. Bush mold, and things would have moved on as they did the last 20 years? Or was change coming anyways, and this administration, for better or worse, is trying to get ahead of the curve?
I think it's the latter. And I think the U.S. was on an unsustainable path. Everybody could see it. The debt and deficit projections and the social promises that are off the books and so on are not going to be paid, at least not in real terms. And confronting that reckoning is probably best achieved by a man who has had 4 years to lament over what went wrong in his first term and to plan with rigor what he'll do in his second, and who frankly doesn't have to stand for re-election. Legally can't at the moment stand for re-election in 2028. The challenge, of course, is whether they pull it off. Again, like a failed attempt at turning this around, one shudders to model, That's the real sort of risk on the board. Trump is a bit chaotic. He's all over the place just on Iran. Our big test case is whether the U.S. goes to war with Iran. I think if Trump is again sending very mixed messages on this, you read the Truth Social post and then you see that Mike Waltz has been moved to the United Nations, which is sort of the outskirts of the Trump sphere of power, if there ever was one. And so we certainly hope that war with Iran is avoided. The path of confrontation means nuclear war with China, and as was alluded to earlier, that puts a lot of people in a lot worse situation, scores of millions of them likely dead. And so we'll see. I think the test case is Iran, even more so than tariffs. I think the confrontation over Iran, again, which is the subject of the piece we're working on now, the sort of linchpin of the Russia-China axis goes through Iran physically and logistically, and so that's the one that we're watching the closest.
As a concluding question, and I hate it because I could continue this conversation at least for another hour. One thing that, Michael, you have talked about, and Doomberg, you have also insightfully written about, is the emerging new relationship between Russia and the United States. Also, what's happening with the United States and OPEC. I think this has been, for some, not for you, I have to say immediately. That's why I'm so happy you're on here, because you really have been ahead of the curve on many of these issues. That oil prices are going down. It's quoting Doomberg, Trump wants $50 oil. It looks like he's going to get it. And one argument that has been made is that all these meetings in Saudi Arabia regarding Ukraine between Russia and the United States probably were about more than Ukraine, and also about energy markets. And Michael, you have a very good joke. Please, you tell it. Why the correct interpretation of the reverse Nixon?
Yeah. So I've been calling it a Noxin, just writing it backwards. And I said it's not going to succeed because it starts with no and it has she in the middle of it. So
what do you think? What can we expect in U.S.-Russian relations in the months to come? If you feel free to speculate.
Sure. Look, very very briefly, I still think Noxin makes the better sense for the U.S. geostrategically, but it takes two to tango. If Putin isn't going to go for that, you are not going to win them over by constantly offering them carrots. There need to be some sticks. And so you're already seeing tentative moves back towards more armaments for Ukraine, back towards the potential of much higher secondary sanctions, 500% in terms of legislation that Lindsey Graham's talking about passing. How that would be enforced, I'm not sure, but you can see the direction of travel. And I think the US will probably continue to try and offer the occasional carrot and wield a stick. But ultimately, what Russia wants to do is what Russia wants to do. And so you're not so much forecasting what the US is going to do, you're forecasting what Russia is going to do. And given the fact that, they've got China right next door, and Xi Jinping's about to be in Moscow standing next to Putin looking at all the tanks and the soldiers waving, it doesn't seem likely that anything's going to move there quickly. And I completely agree, and I'd very much like to hear what Doomberg's going to say about Iran, because I think also that is the complete pivot. And, before I listen to him, I just wonder if at some point, rather than war, you don't see an American aircraft carrier in the Gulf of Hormuz checking every single ship going out to see what oil is on it, whether that is or isn't practical. That would be something that, at least geostrategically, I would be thinking about as a potential US option in what today we saw may now be the Gulf of Arabia, not the Persian Gulf.
Yeah, I think it was just alluded to. Much depends on what happens on May 9th. Wildly underreported in the Western media is, I think, rather amazing threats that Zelensky has been making about not being able to, assure the safety of the foreign leaders who are attending Putin's parade, as he calls it. If there is an attack on Moscow while Xi Jinping is in attendance, I think that is an all bets are off situation and could lead to radical escalation. Let's pray that does not happen for a variety of important reasons. But secondarily, one of the things we're looking to see coming out of Moscow, because whenever you have Putin and Xi Jinping together for multiple days, there's an enormous amount of pre-planning that has gone into this and deals that have been agreed to in advance, is whether or not the Power Siberia 2 project finally gets approved. That would mark a sort of permanent rewiring of the molecules that used to flow to Western Europe towards South and towards China. It's a very long-standing project, and the Chinese always drive a hard bargain. But if we see that announcement, we wouldn't be surprised. And then on Iran, very similar to the Russia situation, I think Trump began his administration looking to extract himself from, and the U.S. from Europe, with a perhaps false understanding of Putin's objectives. The sanctions aren't going to work, not even the sort of 500% sanctions that Lindsey Graham has been threatening in the halls of Congress. Russia and China are self-sufficient. They will both ignore sanctions. And the real issue then comes down to Iran. I think Trump also started his administration wanting to settle the Middle Eastern question, that bizarre press conference where he talked about developing Gaza, the ceasefire that was initially negotiated by Witkoff even before Trump became president, and Trump's sort of desire to cut a deal with Iran. We just see such schizophrenic behavior out of this administration. It's hard to know which wing is in the lead, the neocons section that wants to go to war, or the more MAGA populist movement that has a bit of an isolationist streak, led most predominantly, I think, by J.D. Vance. And I think whether a conflict breaks out in Iran is the ultimate acid test for how the next 3.5 years will unfold and what happens thereafter. But all bets off on a terrorist attack in Moscow on the 9th. Just keep that on your radar as a potential black swan event.
So very quickly, the last place that we haven't talked much about, and I guess I have to bring both of you back to do this in an additional session at some point in the near future. If energy flows from Russia are redirected to Asia, if something also, Doomberg, you wrote about quite a bit, if energy in the United States will be needed and used for the AI revolution, where will that leave Europe? What I said before, Michael, will the average person get poorer? Let me rephrase my question and say, will the average European like myself get poorer? Or is there risk of getting poorer?
I can't speak for you, Ralph, and you're not average, but I would have to say...
That is very kind.
I would have to say that there is a worryingly high probability that could happen, because Draghi himself in his report, which as I mentioned last time we spoke, we'd front run in Rabo predicting that he would say the kind of things that he did, radical as they were. He said if we don't do it, Europe suffers slow agony. And that doesn't sound like the average person doing better, and it's a very, very tall order to do everything that Europe needs to do at once, particularly if the US is more antagonistic towards it rather than helpful, which is entirely probable if Europe drifts closer towards China or can't come into the US bloc the way the US wants. So again, no energy expert here, and I think Doomberg will have again a better answer than me. It seems logical to me that it's going to be Qatar that they'll be looking to, but whether Qatar can continue to provide them with that if the US doesn't want them to, or there are untoward developments in the Middle East, remains to be seen. I mean, the US of course can supply Europe, but that puts Europe on the wrong end of a realpolitik negotiation they may not want to accept. For the moment, the headlines are about Europe saying we'll buy more energy from the US, but we expect that to then resolve all the other differences between us. That's not how it works. That's absolutely not how it works.
Yeah, and I think we have to make sure that we don't confuse availability of supply with the price of that supply. Mm-hmm. We wrote a piece called Project Porcupine, which poked fun at Ursula von der Leyen's crazy rearmament plan to turn Ukraine into a metal porcupine or something like that. With very simple math, Ralph, the European Union, the 27 member states of the European Union, consume 40 exajoules of hydrocarbons every year, and they produce 6. And so they import roughly the equivalent of the entire U.S. natural gas production every year, and they have to pay the cost of capital for every exploration, development, intermediary, midstream, cargo owners, terminal operators, everybody involved from where the wellhead is to where the hydrocarbons are burned has to earn their cost of capital. And this is why if you're not back integrated, you may be able to secure supply, but you will not be able to do so at a price that makes your industrial capacity competitive, which is why we're seeing the deindustrialization of Europe and Germany in particular, and why the war in Ukraine was so catastrophic for Germany, because it went from cheap, steady pipeline natural gas from Russia to globally sourced expensive LNG, predominantly from the US and Qatar. When you import 34 exajoules of hydrocarbons a year and only produce 6, you're not going to be an industrial power. And no non-industrial power is a relevant military power. It just doesn't work that way. No amount of euro printing and flashy reports from former central bankers is going to change that, but not even euro bonds. And so, as we said in the piece, Project Porcupine, they simply don't have the jewels. And so it's just not going to happen. That's our view.
Yeah. So we end a bit on where we started, that GDP, they say age is just a number, but in the current world, GDP potentially is also just a number. We have to look under the hood of what's actually going on. Michael Avery, you can find Michael's work under Rabobank/knowledge. He's also very active on LinkedIn, but my favorite outlet for Michael is X or Twitter, what it is called. I think your daily updates are fantastic. They also have great screenshots with them, and there's always, sometimes at least, some mockery towards the columnist of the Financial Times, which I personally always, nothing personal, but I enjoy it always very much. Doomberg can be found on Substack. Is it just www.doomberg.com or is it www.doomberg.substack.com?
It's all combinations. We have secured the rights to,
excellent.
We kicked a squatter off of Doomberg.com, so that's probably the easiest way to find us. Just it wasn't cheap, but what of value in life isn't worth paying for. At Doomberg.com or newsletter.doomberg.com or just Google Doomberg Substack. You'll find us that way. Michael, Ralph, it was a fantastic discussion. Really appreciated and honored to be part of it.
No, thank you so much. And I hope we can do this again in the future. I can only once again emphasize to our viewers and listeners, the two of you have been oracles in many ways over the last 12 to 18 months. I'm always a little bit hesitant to share you guys with somebody else because now I can no longer pretend that I know everything because they say, oh, you just listen to Michael and Doomberg and that's why you know all that stuff. But I had to give up my secret at some point. Michael, Doomberg, thank you so much for coming on Brussels Signal. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Anytime.